I hear people like watching afterwards the next week, and I have some customers actually on commute. They listen on the audio only, so they're just tuning in. I think that's it. I'll stop sharing. I'll let Victor share his screen, and I think we can pick up where we left last time. I think what's the next topic, Victor? Is it
I
packages?
missed last week.
Yeah,
I couldn't
packaging.
watch the. Yeah,
We
go ahead.
figured out how to create compositions, and now then what comes next is to package it. Now, packaging
Why?
is optional, just to make it clear. Uh, you can just apply those manifests directly, as we were doing so far, right? The cool thing about packaging, actually, there are two cool things, really. One is that anybody can just, instead of, hey, I need those files, what's or not, it's just a container image, right? That you just pull essentially, and it expands into whatever manifest. It's equivalent of zipping up all those manifests, right? The more important thing, at least from my perspective, is that packaging, when you package something, you can define the dependencies so that, hey, I want to use those compositions, but then you will automatically get installed dependencies that are missing. Like, oh, this composition requires this or that from AWS or whatever else it is. So it kind of manages dependencies and simplifies it in a way.
Yeah, and it becomes more important in organizations. Like I work with customers that use Crossplane, and there's just different teams have like they have a package for databases, and another one has a one for networking. The way of doing networking, but they don't really know what are the CRDs from the other team. So they just do packages to package their dependencies, and then Crossplane knows like what to pull in terms of providers.
Exactly.
And you can put the URL, right? I think you in the package you can put like I want to pull. I had a customer pulling from an internal registry. They don't have to be like public. You can host
Oh
them
yeah, so
internally in your own company.
I'll show it soon. I will be using Upbound registry simply because, hey,
Yeah, it's
it's
easier now.
available to me.
Yeah,
But it's just a way to package the list of dependencies and the manifests in a container image that can be pushed to any registry. There is no restriction. It's just a container image, right, with certain instructions for Crossplane. So you can
so
push it anywhere you want.
maybe I'll ask the first question. So the first time
Sure.
I saw packages was I've been using Kubernetes and Helm have become our npm. I'm very Node.js person. our package way of like package 1.1 of this thing that I want to install in my cluster. And then when I saw Crossplane having packages, I thought it was going to be a Helm package or a Helm chart that somebody creates and then I install it in my cluster because that's the way that I install things, scan things, and do things. But then Crossplane was using the YAML files, put it inside a container, which is similar of like what Flux is doing with putting YAML files inside a container image. And
Yeah. I mean, the logic behind it is really that we feel that container images are becoming the de facto standard of packaging stuff, right? I mean, actually, when I package, I don't work much with Helm, but that's a separate story, right? But I package my Helm charts as a container image as well.
yep.
Kind of, to me, container images are the standard how to package. What's inside, that's a completely different story, right?
Yeah, and then that's I think that's the conclusion I saw. Like I think Crossplane was looking forward of like container image is a URL that is already like inside your company, inside your network, is accessible. So
Yeah.
putting the assets in there that became first citizen and Helm. I think it was 3 dot something. They added Helm push and Helm pull. Like the Helm CLI actually helps you package
Yeah.
Helm package in an OCI artifact and then became container. So I think that's kind of the valuable thing of like if you already have like a server that has assets and these images, let's put the other stuff in there because if you're going to set up like a Helm museum or an HTTP server, it's another thing that you have to babysit.
Exactly. It just makes everything, at least in my case, everything so much easier. Like if I work with applications that are nothing to do with Crossplane, I would still like package, Helm chart as container image, or I tend to use Timonier. Timonier is container image together with signatures as container images and container images of application itself. So everything is container image.
Yep.
Okay, so as before, please, I really enjoy conversation, so stop me at any moment. Don't let me speak for too long. But until you do, just very quickly, just a proof, right? What I did, like every chapter starts with the setups. In this case, setup did not do anything except install Crossplane itself. So I have no compositions in my cluster, and I have no kubectl get pkg rev. I have no packages installed, right? So it literally cannot do anything. And the reason why this chapter starts like that, just to show you how, not only how to package, but how you would deploy the package later. So what I have here in this directory, ls-l, I have compositions that we were looking at before, like for AWS, Azure, and Google, and the definition, that's the manifest that defines what will become CRD. What is new here is the Crossplane YAML, right? So if I output Crossplane YAML, this basically defines all the things that Crossplane needs to convert stuff into that container image that we call configuration package. Now, annotations are not that important. I mean, they might be important. I will not go into details unless you ask me, but basically, we can, if you publish it to the Abound marketplace, which is similar to Docker Hub, right, for Crossplane packages, right? So let me actually backtrack for a second. You might want to package your stuff for internal usage, or you might want to package it and make it available to others outside of your organization, right? Kind of community sharing. And in the latter case, those annotations are used to show when you go to marketplace, to show additional information like description, readme, and what's not, right? Well, but what really matters is the spec section, which basically has only two things. One is what is the specific version of Crossplane that is required for the package, in this case 1.14, and what it depends on, right? In this example, later on you will see other examples. All my dependencies are for now providers, right? There is AWS EC2, AWS RDS, Azure DB for PostgreSQL, GCP SQL, and provider SQL, which basically I use to create users and a few other things in compositions, right? So those are basically dependencies. Similar dependencies, since we already mentioned Helm, right? It's a similar concept like dependencies in Helm or whatever. Maybe I'm wrong about the naming, right? But I think that Helm calls it dependencies or something like that. That basically can pull additional things beyond what you're really packaging. And the way to package is with the Crossplane xpg command, which you can just say build, right? And that build generated this file. This is Crossplane package file that contains now all the information plus all the manifests. Basically, this file contains all these YAML files plus the list of dependencies that we saw earlier.
So, Victor, there's a question on the chat from Robert. He's saying that I'm trying to rephrase the container image, not just a container of YAML files, but then you have the layers. So an extra dimension of usability as opposed to just having zip files and uploading that into the OCI artifact to a registry.
Yes.
So I think
it's metadata. Metadata, those list of those dependencies in those YAML files, not much more.
So in Crossplane, in OCI spec, and they added like new artifacts in version of OCI, but in general, an OCI image, which is a Docker image, it has the layers like you mentioned, like the layers are just TGZ, and then the metadata is stored as a manifest.json of the OCI. You can store metadata in there, but in Crossplane, they use this file, kpkg, and other, like the metadata files are part of the image, part of the layer. That information is not stored in the outside, the manifest.json. Like it's a convention of these files inside the layer.
Essentially, it's this. Think of it as this file, which is replacement for tar file in a way that contains everything from this directory. It's a very dumb thing.
Just because it was a container file, I just thought you could use layers if you wanted to. So someone could use your upbound package as on the first line as from that image, and then they could replace or add additional files as well if they wanted to. Gives you that flexibility.
I never tried it, to be honest.
Yeah, they could, but
so
I
I'm
don't think
not
in practice
sure.
this happens like that. No, like that. It's like a one layer image is like the same thing as Helm. Like Helm, when you do Helm, I think push, it just takes the Helm chart and just creates one chart in that one image, and there will be no more layers. It's just a convenient way of packaging files.
And to be clear, kind of this package that will become soon a container image never becomes a container, right? So those images never become containers. It just internally Crossplane extracts that and uses it to basically execute the query. Basically, what Crossplane does is that extracts stuff from the package, which is in container image, and does equivalent of executing kubectl apply, right?
Yeah.
And then apply all the dependencies from Crossplane YAML as well. It's a fancy way, a loop of kubectl applies. I'm simplifying it now, but it's not far from truth.
And that XPKG can be inspected, right? It's a tar file. Oh, sorry, go ahead.
Say again.
I asked, is there a verbose mode where you could actually see the steps being executed? The YAML files being applied?
-V6 maybe?
I haven't tried
-V, verbose?
But he's asking to apply it when
it's
it's
just for my education.
Cluster,
it's
right?
just for my education, just to see how things are sequenced, and because this is fascinating. I just haven't heard of this before. This is really cool.
Yeah, I never tried it, to be honest, because stuff will be extracted from it within a cluster.
Yeah, so the logs.
I'm not sure.
Like I
or
thought it was
something.
the packaging. The packaging, I guess, it has a verbose mode that you can see here. But when it's applying, that's like the container that is running Crossplane. You can check the logs. Maybe you put debug, and you will see the logs behind the scenes. Like the container behind the scenes is the one doing the fetching and applying.
But yeah, the building itself is verbose. Is not very verbose.
Okay.
Anyway, so
but you will see the errors, like in terms of troubleshooting, Jack. If you're accessing a package that is not available and you HTTP errors or proxy, the place to look for that details will be in the Crossplane pod that is running that has a container. You will see all the logs there of like trying to fetch a package and then not trying to get it and extracting and all that. And you can put debug mode. I guess it depends on how verbose it is behind the scenes, the installation part. I think Victor haven't shown the installation part yet.
No, not yet. But yeah, you're right. You can see the logs in the pods, and you can also do kubectl describe of the resource itself, and then you would see events, kind of pulling this and then extracting, then failing to do this. So events and logs.
Events is the mantra of like debugging Crossplane. Like remember that. If you don't
find anything,
exactly. It will be an
I'm
event.
big on events. I rarely go to logs. I'm not talking about Crossplane. You were kind of like, to me, it's always first events and then logs. Logs in my head is usually kind
events,
of like
logs described. That all sounds familiar. That all sounds normal.
Yeah, and I think that that's the good thing and a problem at the same time of Crossplane. Crossplane assumes that person using it is very familiar with Kubernetes, right? Mm-hmm. So there are many things that you will not really get even good explanation of related to Crossplane in the docs. Because Crossplane, I'm not sure that Crossplane ever explains that you can see what's going on by looking at the events through kubectl describe, right? It just somehow assumes that, that's what you would normally do, right? In
the Kubernetes way, right?
Yeah. Exactly. Where was I? This is cool. So now I can, let me see, what did I have? There we go. I can create a repository. I don't know whether I have this repository already. So I'm creating repository in Upbound, but again, you can use any repository you want. That's all good. And then what I'm going to do is I'm already logged into this repository, and I will just say, hey, push. Basically, this is equivalent of Docker image push, right? Push this package as or convert. This can be this is kind of build an image and push at the same time. Convert that package into an image with this address and the tag, and push it to the whichever registry you chose. In my case, Upbound, right? And now basically,
so how does it know to pick up that file xpkg? You didn't specify the file name.
No. It looks for the xpkg in the directory, right? So if you have xpkg in the directory, it will pick it up. I'm not sure whether you can explicitly set it. I haven't tried it. There we go. Package files.
Okay.
Right, but you don't have to
more
specify
than one.
it.
Okay.
Yeah, you can have more than one. But if that's the only thing, in most cases, people would have one set of compositions that become single package in a directory. I haven't seen many cases where people have multiple packages in the same directory, and in that case, you don't need to specify anything except really the address of the registry, essentially, and you know the name of the image and the tag. So now what I'm going to do, this is one of the annoying things that I think we're doing it wrong. I'm a freak about keeping things clean, right? So I always delete the package from the local file system. I don't want to have them there.
So
anyways,
Victor, just maybe a comment. And this of like Crossplane, I think it was Crossplane build or was up build. I think it's the same thing, right? The CLI.
There is, in this book I'm using Crossplane for everything, not really up CLI, but there is up CLI, which basically has the Crossplane CLI functionalities and then plus, right?
So I was going to say that this is typically the workflow that is like you're building a package and then versioning that package and then pushing it to a registry. This will be something that you put in your CI/CD pipeline. As you edit your compositions in Git, there will be a GitHub action or a Jenkins that automatically release that. Like we're doing it manually, but like in enterprise or production level, you have a CI/CD pipeline or a GitHub action.
Yeah, this is, for example, this is not the same repository, but this is, for example, a pipeline for one of my compositions. And basically, I'm here. Okay, you cannot see easily because I'm using DevBox to run package publish. But inside of that DevBox, basically what I'm doing, let me find it. Where are you? I don't know where did I put it now? Why is it not here? View all files. Cool. Basically, I'm using, in this case, DevBox calls just file, basically, where is it? Here, right? Same commands. Hey, log into the registry, build it, push it, remove it, keep it clean, and that's it, right?
That's your clean. Okay.
Okay. Nice. Where was I? Yeah. So I'm going back now to the root of that repository, and there is a configuration. Basically, now whomever wants to use that package, right, would write something like this. There is a CLI command to do this. Don't ask me what the command is. I don't like doing things through CLIs without specifying a manifest, right? I like keeping everything in Git. Anyways, this would be basically how now users of this package would use it, right? There is a configuration, a name, whichever name you want, and hey, I want to use this package, right? Which is .sql 07, right? And there's not much more to it than that, right?
But this is the magic bit, because if I want to use this .sql, I don't need to specify the providers that you're using in one of your compositions. Like if you decide to add another one, I don't need to add it, or do I?
Yeah. So for example, if I would add additional providers, and I'll show dependencies soon, but if I would change to 08 and 08 would have additional providers, when you would upgrade to 008, you would get those additional providers. Or if I change the versions of providers, Crossplane would upgrade those providers and so on and so forth.
Right.
So basically, it's kind of, the logic is, hey, this is the configuration, this is the package I want, and bring everything that is required for those compositions to work, whatever that something is. Now, when I say everything, that's completely misleading and not true. There are some cases where that will not work, and I will show you that in a few minutes. But at least that's the idea.
Okay.
Okay. So if I do now kubectl apply that same file, right? And if I do kubectl get packages in my if you remember, I started with no packages, and now you can see that I have 2 packages for now. There will be more, and there are different types of packages. This is configuration package that is basically .sql 007. That's the one that I just pushed there, and I just instructed my cluster to use it, right? Now, right now there is only one because you still did not figure out, but if I refresh this again, you will see that there are more, right? Now, this .sql started installing provider SQL and provider AWS EC2 and AWS RDS and so on and so forth, right? And basically now it is installing everything that is required to run those compositions, all the dependencies apart from the compositions themselves. And if I look at the compositions, get compositions, you will see none. And that's because compositions will be applied after the packages are healthy, right? So it takes a while. Like you can see that some are finished, but for example, GCP SQL is still not fully operational, and few others like AWS RDS, right? So this will probably download. Let me see. kubectl get CRDs vc -l. Why doesn't work? vc c -l, right? This is now installing the CRDs. Essentially, those providers are CRDs. Right now there is 184. I think that more or less that's the number that should be. So eventually they will all be true. Now this is a perfect moment for question. You have 1 minute approximately until it's all running.
So yeah, questions. If not, I'll ask one question. Questions? I have one. So in this case, this is also good for people to understand. Like, there's a lot of like practices in the way that this works. Like, for example, when you deploy a CRD normally, like outside Crossplane, you would like install the CRDs separately from the controllers that have implement those CRDs, and then you have to implement afterwards the CRs, like the resources that implement the CRDs. And this is where a lot of people get into trouble with implementing something like GitOps or declarative, like there's no ordering, and they go into like, I need to force the CRDs before the CRs, or maybe the containers depend on the CRD. Sometimes some of the controllers put some checks on the CRDs. They shouldn't, but they put, and you have to have that ordering of like CRD, controller, and CR. In this case, Crossplane is solving some of those issues because the CRDs are really not installed by Crossplane. The Crossplane deploys a pod, a container that is kind of the controller, and the controller itself, it spits out its own CRD. So it's kind of like a dealing with that, so you don't have to like know which CRDs to install with which controller, or the controller and CRD. Is that correct, Victor? Like
that
shift
correct.
of
Exactly.
mentality, I think is a good thing that Crossplane has.
Yeah, basically you can think of it as being higher level abstraction, right? Typically in a different scenarios, you would, as you said, kind of, oh, I need CRDs. I don't know, I'm installing this Ingress controller, whatever it is. I need CRDs first, and then I can install this and that and so on and so forth, right? This almost like higher level abstraction. That container image basically contains all the files, and then Crossplane itself knows I do this and then that, and basically does things in certain order, right? It's very similar effect as what you would get if you would work with raw things and specify a bunch of sync waves if you would be using Argo CD, right?
Yep. Yeah, and then the RBAC is handled by Crossplane. There's something in Crossplane called RBAC Manager that
Yes.
needs to give permission to someone to put these global resources, CRDs, right? No one by itself can install CRDs. You have to have cluster kind of admin to install CRDs. And that's something that Crossplane kind of like handles inside for you.
Exactly. Okay, while we
How
were
about
talking
that?
about, oh yeah,
How about
Say again?
that? I said,
Yeah.
I'm just reacting. Wow, that's cool.
yeah,
I get
yeah.
it.
So
I can look at it. I
CRDs
get it.
are-
I get it. Yeah.
CRDs are configuration is there. Configuration created other configurations and providers and what's not. Those providers created CRDs and controllers and what's not. And at the end of the process, I got those three compositions. Those are the same compositions we worked with before in the previous chapters: AWS, Azure, Google databases. Right now, another thing that I need to do is now I can create stuff, databases, hyperscalers. But apart from specifying which configuration somebody wants to use, I do need to manually set up, at least when we're talking about Crossplane open source, manually set up the credentials, right? So I do need also provider config that will essentially say, hey, in case of AWS, configure AWS resources to use the secret that is called AWS creds and the key is creds, right? Basically, this is me now authenticating part of, not all, but some of those resource definitions to communicate with something, in this case with AWS, right? So I have to apply that one as well.
So Victor, one thing on this pet peeve of me, right? We just talked about Crossplane is so awesome to install everything declarative. If you look at the API version line of this provider config, I cannot install this provider config YAML file before the provider is installed.
Exactly, because
so you have to work with the sync waves to handle that.
Yeah, and now you're touching on a subject that I can speak for 2 hours about sync waves, how bad they are. But anyways, there is so the thing is that there are many provider configs with different APIs, right? And then now this is provider config for AWS, and then you would have something very similar called also provider config for Azure and whatever else you're using. But yes, if I try to execute this, to apply this manifest before I applied configuration, or even shortly after, this would not work, right? Only after the providers, for at least one provider for AWS was installed, this becomes available, right?
Yep. And just to finalize, like in Argo CD, there's a solution. It's not sync waves. You can put an annotation on this resource saying, go ahead and retry it. Like continue if it's not defined the CRD, and the next one will apply it.
Yeah, kind of ignore the error.
I
and
think
then
skip.
Next
Yeah,
time
skip
you
if
get
not
to
defined.
it.
Yeah. So if you want to know, like I have repos and examples with that.
Okay, and there is one more thing, which is this one. Let me actually output it on the screen. Actually, if I go back to what was it? I forgot, where did I have those? Where was I? Providers .sql7. So providers .sql7. I think no. I forgot which was the directory where I put the packages. Let me see again. Come on, Victor, don't be stupid. Trying to find it. I'll find it, I promise. Compositions, yes. So one thing here in compositions directory, SQL7, when I showed you Crossplane YAML, you will notice that I had one commented, right? Even though my compositions require Kubernetes provider also for some things. I did not include it into the configuration, and I hope that we will fix that soon, simply because installing this provider as is would not work. And it will not work for a reason that I will show in a second, as soon as I get back to where I was. There we go. Because for a Kubernetes provider to work, it needs to be something like this, right? Apart from the provider. So I could specify this in as a dependency, right? It's just a provider. But for the Kubernetes provider to work correctly, I need to have a service account so that it has permissions to work with the inside of the same cluster, and then to do cluster role binding, and then to then I can install the Kubernetes provider. Sorry, I can configure the provider, and I can tell it, hey, use this service account.
Yeah,
right?
for that
we don't have a
pod,
mechanism.
use the service account. Yeah,
exactly. So basically, if I put it as dependency, this provider would be installed, but it would not know about the which service account to use. That will be solved eventually, but right now I need to apply it myself, right? So it's almost all dependencies can be specified, right?
Yeah, the way I handle that, at least for some of my setups and end users, I use Helm charts. I deploy the Helm charts with the providers that I want, and I want the AWS provider or the Upbound, the Helm, and the Kubernetes, and in Helm I have all this configuration, right?
Exactly. They're kind of. I know that there is an open. What's the word? Open feature request for that. I haven't checked before this meeting where it is, but anyways, you need to do it manually. Package it in a Helm chart, put it in Git, whatever you want. But few of them you need manually. Those with special care. Now, so the user would actually, ignoring now Kubernetes provider, the user of it would just have the simple manifest. This one, no, not that one. The other one that says, I want this configuration. Configuration expands into all the providers, everything required, excluding exceptions. And then the user could just say, hey, I want to apply this claim. Actually, let me show the claim. This is the same as what we used. What we used in the previous chapter, right? I'm creating the same claim as before, except that now all that is required for that claim comes from that configuration, from that package. So I can just say kubectl apply, and then if I look at what's happening in a cluster, you can see that now Crossplane is working, making it happen, right? As before, if you remember, some things will be failing because they cannot be created. Like right now, it is creating VPC, so it's logical that it cannot do anything with subnet because subnet needs information about the VPC. But eventually, it will be consistent. Eventually, it will be working. Now you see one less thing. No, still failing. Eventually, it will work, right? And that's all there is to it. This is probably the shortest chapter in the book. That's all there is about packages.
And if I go to the Upbound marketplace, I should be able to see this package.
Yes. So
or you can make your packages private, right? That's another option.
Yes. They are private. They're. Let me make this bigger. They're private by default, if I'm not mistaken. And
I think so. Yeah.
To be honest, I'm not sure under which I published it now. Yeah, I probably not this account. But yeah, it would appear. So what will happen is that if you go to this, if you go to any other registry, then whichever registry you're using, in case of a marketplace, it would appear as private, right? And then you would see it as configurations, right? I don't have any. There are no my private configuration in this account. I published it as nobody knows which one. But if you go to all, you would see something similar. This is unlike for the book, right? This is very similar to .sql. This is not the same, but similar to a package that I made public that is similar to what we're building in the book.
So Victor,
Francisco, I
question.
see it. Yeah, anything.
Okay, so this is a best practices question. I can see from the compositions that you set up PostgreSQL on 3 different hyperscalers. So that's good. So now going forward, would I set my kube control context to AWS and do stuff, and then switch over to a Google Cloud and do stuff, and switch my Google my kube control context, or would I do everything in Crossplane?
So you
What's
would
the best
do.
practice?
So think of this. Think of this cluster as being. We call it control plane cluster, right? This is from which you manage stuff. In this example, I'm now managing some things in AWS and some other things in the same cluster and so on and so forth. If I would apply a claim for Azure, I would continue using that same cluster to manage things in Azure as well, right? So think of this as being the main cluster from which you manage stuff.
Okay.
It could be even stuff in other Kubernetes clusters. Doesn't matter, right? Now, in some cases, when we're talking about much bigger systems, I've seen quite a few companies that have multiple control plane clusters, but that's more like, hey, we want to have different tenants, physical separation, and what's not, right? But ignoring now that large scale, yeah, you have one cluster from which you manage whatever you want to manage.
Right. So just from my experience, going for the between the different hyperscalers, the load balancers are different, and that's not bad. It's just different. Does Crossplane abstract the load balancers or the ingress, or do I still need to split out and switch my kube control context to Google Cloud to handle the Google ingress load balancer? What's the best practice there?
So let me rephrase your question just to see whether I understood, right?
Okay.
So if you would use Crossplane to manage ingress in some other cluster, is that the question?
Yeah, I have some compositions spread across 3 different cloud providers, and each cloud provider happens to have a different kind of ingress. And my mental model here is I need to switch kubectl context and just dive into the Google specific ingress.
No, but this is more like, so right now I'm running cluster in none of those 3. I'm running cluster in my laptop. This is a kind cluster.
Right, but Crossplane, yes, the Crossplane.
Yeah,
right.
and then, now if I would have a composition that creates a Kubernetes cluster, and that cluster would, among other things, have pre-installed ingress, then yes, definition how if the cluster is in AWS, then
okay. I see. Okay.
Yeah,
but basically, those 3 compositions are in big part completely different. So if I list kubectl get compositions, those 3 the definitions for those 3 compositions are different, right?
Yes.
What it does in AWS has nothing to. No, it doesn't have to have anything to do with what it does in Azure. Now, there are some common things, like the way how I create users in Postgres, schema in Postgres might be the same, but yeah, they're completely different definitions.
I think Jack also has like a use case that I have come across. So so Victor covered of like, because the thing is, you pick up a resource that is a Kubernetes resource. In Kubernetes, we have an object called ingress, and another one called service. And those Kubernetes resources are supposed to be generic. The thing is that when you create a service or a ingress, and these are resources, nothing to do with Crossplane, this is for your Hello World app. Those, when are installed in a Kubernetes cluster that has a controller of a hypervisor to create an appliance like a load balancer or a global load balancer in your cloud provider, that Kubernetes object would need to have certain annotations if it's a service, or if it's an ingress, it will have like a class, and I guess also annotation specific to that cloud provider. So some folks, what they do is they go into trouble because they want to deploy a ingress resource, Kubernetes resource, in my little box, Linux box that I have at home that I'm using Nginx, and I need to put certain annotations. And then I want to use the same app in, let's say, in EKS, in AWS, and I want to use the same ingress.yaml, but they're different. So one of the things that you can do is use a Helm chart to kind of decide how you want to add those annotations or not. But I guess Jack also brings the point that you can create a composition where you can say, create me an ingress and use the Kubernetes provider to say, I'm selecting the one in my house, or I'm selecting the one in AWS, and then add those extra variables. And then that's a way you can extract a Kubernetes resource. So I got a phone call, but wanted to highlight that. That's why kind of like the question was kind of a little bit confusing, at least for myself, because he just picked Ingress CR instead of being a database or a VM or an S3 bucket or a AI role or a VPC or a subnet, right? Those things are like compositions handle that.
Yeah, and especially the next chapter, I will go through functions that give you even more freedom or simplify certain things, kind of variations between, but in this case, I want this thing, 99% of this thing, but slightly modified. And another thing, this is nothing to do with Crossplane. Jack, use Gateway API. A lot of things will improve.
That's also true. Like the Ingress became V1, so we created Ingress API. There's a question from Raji Saifet. Go ahead.
Yes, hi, Carlos. It's safe, Carlos, by the way. For Victor, I have a question, please, regarding provider config. Provider config are namespaces, right? Or is it like cluster-wide resource?
No, provider configs are cluster scoped.
Okay, so basically any user who has access to see them can have access to them and use them, right? So basically, if
yes, any user who has permission permissions to see that config has permissions to use that config, right?
Okay.
Now, in significant number of cases I've seen, people are allowed to create only claims, right? So cluster is already configured. You can only create claims which are namespace scoped. And more often than not, those claims are combined with some policy tool like Hiverno or OPA Gatekeeper that you cannot go outside of whatever you're supposed to be allowed, right?
So if I can list them, I can probably guess which one has like admin access, and I can do a lot in AWS account. It's like there is no like separation.
Yes, but I think that's one of the differences between Crossplane and other tools that manage resources like Terraform, right? You're not really executing a CLI command that does things somewhere, like in AWS. What you're doing is that you're sending requests to Kubernetes API and saying, I want to claim this thing, right? And you're setting the permissions at that level, at Kubernetes API level. Okay, but you know what? This team can only operate on this namespace level, and they can do this and they cannot do that, which are separate permissions from what Crossplane can do, right? So Crossplane can do this and that in AWS, but that's irrelevant for you as a human, right? As a person. For you, what matters is that you can do this and that in this namespace. You can create these Kubernetes resources rather than thinking about which resources you can do in AWS or not, right? And also there is option, and many use it, that you can have multiple configurations. But the important part is that for the end users, you are protecting things at Kubernetes API level, not at the hyperscaler level.
So I need to know which APIs I need to give them in their role binding. Exactly. For example, they need only to create EC2s like claims, something like that.
I can answer some of like based on practice of what we do with AWS on some of my customers. So what you're describing is a multi-tenancy setup where basically the pattern and the Crossplane documentation explain this pattern of how to use namespaces, multi-tenancy, and claims. So you need to have two hats. The first hat is as an administrator of that cluster that's going to become a management cluster. You have permission of everything on that cluster. It's like the kind cluster in your laptop. You can install Crossplane, the providers, you can create namespaces, you can install CRDs, and you can create composite, you can create Crossplane managed resources, and you can create claims, everything. But now you are a platform engineer or an admin. Now you have 100 users that are going to log into that cluster and they want to deploy AWS resources. What you're going to do is you're going to assign a namespace to that user, and that user can only create claims. They cannot do anything else. And the other thing is, a lot of examples in Crossplane, in the claims, they allow the user to provide the provider config name. That's an anti-pattern. And I have a really strong opinions of that. The examples have it because of convenience, but that's an anti-pattern. When you want to give your users is an API that they can give you, like, I want a database, but they don't select the provider config because that's selecting which account, which permission you have. In your composition, you're going to, one of the strategies is take the namespace name, and that becomes the provider config name that you're going to attach to it. And that provider config will have an AIM role that only have access to create a database and nothing else. So you can have multiple provider configs that are associated with a IRSA or AIM role that only has minimal access. So that's basically how you create a namespace multi-tenancy setup. And that's the intention. There's not a lot of, maybe this is book 2 for Victor to explain, like, multi-tenancy best practices, how to use claims, right? And how to secure something that, and that's what one of the first questions when I started with Crossplane was like, well, how come like people are like selecting the provider config? They can do everything they can. And actually it was an anti-pattern. The provider config is something that you deduce and you logically select which permission that claim needs, and then you select a provider config that you already configure with minimum access. Sorry for my rant, but this is something I deal like every week.
To rephrase slightly what you said, basically, imagine that you forget everything you saw in today's session. You would say, and let's say for the sake of argument that the only thing, and this is not valid, but for the sake of argument, the only thing that people can do is create databases, whatever, in AWS. You would say, hey, in this namespace, this team can create SQL claim. And there is no specification here which is the configuration, where are the credentials, none of those things. You can create SQL claim, and that's the only thing you can do. And then if you go further, you can say, hey, but I will have policies that in case of this namespace, you can create SQL claim, but the provider label must be AWS. You cannot even create Azure, even though that's possible in a composition itself. But basically, this is the only thing that you're giving people to do. And behind the scenes, this SQL claim will create a RDS, and it will create VPC and subnets and what's not, whatever you designed it. But that's completely invisible to your users. They're creating something called SQL claim. That's all.
Did that answer your question, Saif? Like the users will not have read access to your provider configs. Only access RBAC access to this SQL. They can read it, but they don't have access to the secret. Maybe.
I would go even further, Carlos. I'm pretty sure you would agree. Actually, I would not give those users even access to that namespace. I would give them zero access to anything in that cluster, and only allow them to push things to Git.
Yeah, that's the best practice.
So zero access.
Yeah,
I want to know what you pushed.
Yeah, usually how I enter the room at clients, like no one have kubectl access at all. Like, why? Like they don't need it. Like
there is a piece of paper with credentials in a safe in case things go terribly wrong, and there is no other thing we can do but access it directly, and that's one person or something like that, right? But except in break class scenario, why would anybody have access to a cluster? Not even admins.
And I don't know, people are like, and maybe because they're learning Kubernetes, they want to have access to everything, right? And they think it's needed. But yeah, the tooling and the abstractions is a way to go. It's the same way of saying, like, you're going to deploy a database because you need a database, but I need access to actually see the logs and the entries inside the instance in the Linux system. Like, why? Like, why do you want to SSH into the EC2 machine that is running the SQL database, right? When you're using RDS, you don't need it.
Exactly,
If you set up
especially since
everything
those
correctly.
that same data would be available in other means like CloudWatch logs,
Yes.
for example, right?
Yeah.
I think Francisco had his hand for a while. Go ahead, Francisco. Hopefully we
Yeah,
answered the best practices and
Yeah,
our rant
sure.
of not using tools correctly. Yeah.
Yeah, my question is very short and straightforward. It's just I was wondering all the time, what are the requirements to set up your own private registry for package? Because it's not clear for me, or maybe I missed it out that point. So if you want to create your package, what are the requirements to get your own registry?
Nothing. So assuming that you're logged into that registry, basically when you execute Crossplane, what was the command? My brain is fried today.
So
Sorry, guys.
Francisco, the registry is just a container registry. You can use Docker.
Okay.
Exactly.
Like it's just a
Okay.
container registry, but you can
Okay.
show one of the configurations, Victor. It has a line that
Perfect.
the front of it is the host name. So you put docker.io there, or you put, in my case, a lot of my customers put the ECR address, and then when they push to the ECR address. So when they log in, they do like the AWS ECR login credentials, Docker login to get the container authentication, and then the registry is literally a container. The outbound UI is what is kind of like nice to have, like the description and the browsing. That's what you get if you use the outbound registry, the browser and the GUI thing, and then.
I
But
was
if not,
thinking more in a kind of on-premise registry.
yeah, it's
Just-
container registry, ECR,
Okay, perfect.
or
Still the same, right?
yeah.
You need permissions to be able to push, like from the command line right now, or from
Okay.
pipelines or whatever. And also you need to configure it in a cluster that Crossplane can
to
pull
pull.
that image,
Yeah.
right?
Okay,
But
perfect.
any registry,
Perfect. Thank you.
ttl.sh.
Okay, got it.
Yeah, you have to give access to the Crossplane pod because it's actually doing a fetch. It's not putting that URL, the image, like in a container, because Victor said, like, you're not going to run a container, but the Crossplane would do like a API request to fetch that TGZ out and then expand it and look at it.
Okay.
So that part of Crossplane needs to have like either like using EKS or workload identity in other providers, right? I want to be very hyperscaler generic work like identity provider that cluster have access to pull from that registry.
Perfect. Thank you.
I think we're top of the hour. I think we cover packages for today.
Yeah.
So
It never happened before that we covered the whole chapter. I'm on fire.
but yeah,
You said it
packages.
was a short chapter, Joe, but it was really
Yeah.
Packages.
Don't ruin it for me. Come on.
Yeah, today was not many questions. I think
I'm
I took
sorry,
over
I'm
the
sorry.
questions. Debbie
Didn't
didn't
mean
have
to.
questions.
Yeah,
I
I'm
think
I'm
she
so
was-
tired. I just, my brain is just a mush. So I just watched that. It was really good.
A long week. But
Yeah.
yeah, some people use packages. Like I said, some of my customers don't use it because like one of the examples of the Kubernetes one, and you don't have to use it. It's just a convenience, right? If you can use it, use it.
If you pushed all those YAML, if you applied all those YAML file except Crossplane YAML, you cannot apply directly, right? But if you apply those same files plus the files with providers, like what we were doing in the previous chapter, we were doing exactly the same without using packages, right? It's just a convenience, not a requirement.
Yeah, and I have a repo. I can put it like for AWS. We maintain a repo with all our Crossplane examples, and we just customize. So customize, we just basically take all the composition. We have a bunch of folders with compositions. And since we don't want to maintain versioning, we just maintain the main branch. We just customize and then install all the YAML files from a folder. And then you get your compositions in. And then the providers is something that people really want to have maintain the version, like for CVEs, like the specific version of the provider, like patch it. They want to maintain that life cycle in the enterprise, so they do it differently.
One thing that attracted me personally to Crossplane, and I'm talking now before I joined Upbound, things like that, is simply that it is let's call it Kubernetes native, right? Kind of whatever you're doing in Kubernetes today, that's whichever practice you think is good for you right now for Kubernetes, that works. It's just a set of Kubernetes resources. That's what it is.
See if I can find the repo. I'll put the repo in the chat. I'll put it in the docs also. This is a repo that when I started, like I think I started Crossplane. Yeah, when I started in AWS, less than 2 years, been working with Crossplane. We have this repo and we've been adding more examples, even Lambda examples, like to deploy a Lambda with an S3 bucket and SQS, like nothing related to Kubernetes. Like I have end users that are not running any apps in Kubernetes, and they just are, the platform team is the one that knows Kubernetes, so they're just deploying Lambdas and SQS. And
that's one of the questions I get fairly often. People very often comment and say something like, "Oh, this Crossplane thing sounds great, but we are not running applications in Kubernetes, right?" And it has nothing to do with it, right? It doesn't matter
How
where
many
you run
times
your
did you have to
applications.
explain it?
Oh, many times, kind of. But yeah, so this is, you need a Kubernetes cluster to manage resources. I couldn't care less where those resources are, whether they're Kubernetes something or Lambdas or anything else.
yeah, we
when
have
you
some of the
see
examples there.
Kubernetes, reconciliation mechanism, you feel like you want to put everything in there. I know it's a bit of an overkill, but yeah, Crossplane is a great solution.
Yeah, it's team choice, right? It's a process and teams, like the team that is like in charge of deploying these things and maintaining it, they're using Kubernetes for something else, and then they have another team that they're using Lambda, SQS, like Kinesis, and we have one. I did one Kinesis Lambda S3 logs to. This was fetch logs from CloudWatch and send it to Datadog. I think it was some simple pattern that they had in Terraform that they wanted to move into Crossplane.
I feel that the biggest problem that Crossplane faces is that very often the people who would be in charge of creating compositions and kind of creating those blueprints for services, they're usually coming from the non-Kubernetes background, right? And this is very confusing then, because there is a team who knows, I don't know, Ansible, Terraform, whichever other tool very well. They know how to create a Kubernetes cluster, but don't know really how to operate it. And then that's a big stumbling block, usually.
Okay, so we'll let it there, and then I guess we'll pick up next week to talk about functions. I'm looking forward to that, and also learning about KCL, because I have a use cases for deploying fleets of clusters, and I want to use KCL to do like select which add-ons to install and then which Helm charts to install, which is not possible. What's possible before functions?
Oh yeah, I will. I have a bunch of I have no examples with KCL, if I remember correctly, in the book, because I dived into KCL after I wrote the book. But I have plenty of examples outside, so we can talk about it. But by the way, KCL is my favorite right now, so huge fan of it.
Yeah, I want to learn about that. So thank you, Victor, for your time. I know it's late. Sevi also, other people are like late on a Friday night. I think if you're here on a Friday night, you're a hardcore cloud native user, learner, right? You want to learn the space. Either you're want to get better at work, or just want to
can't get enough
move to tech, right? Some people want to move to tech, and then also, like the professor said, he's learning and applying that to the students. So thank you so much, and we'll see you next week. And I'll upload the video this weekend when I cut the parts and edit. So thank you, Victor, again. We'll see you next week. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Thanks a lot, guys, for joining us. See you next week.
Yep.
And
bye.
take care. Have a great weekend. Bye-bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Have a good one.
Thank you.